My brother stood up at the Thanksgiving dinner table, grabbed my walker, and shoved it violently across the room. "Let us see how disabled you really are," he mocked, as gravity dragged me down. I hit the hardwood floor hard, my bad knee twisting sharply. The entire room erupted with laughter. I was still struggling to catch my breath when my husband walked in. He took one look at me, pulled out his phone, and said 5 words that shattered my brother completely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated you. Stand up and get your own damn plate, Tessa. You are not paralyzed, you are just lazy. DeAndre stood towering over the dining table, his custom-tailored suit straining against his shoulders. The Thanksgiving spread before us was massive, an absolute feast of roasted turkey collard greens, candied yams, and cornbread dressing, but the atmosphere felt entirely like a hostile courtroom. I gripped the handles of my walker, my knuckles turning white with the effort. The spinal cord injury from the car accident 3 years ago still sent terrible lightning bolts of pain down my left leg, but I kept my face completely blank. I was so used to this dynamic by now. "DeAndre, leave your sister alone," my mother, Brenda, said. However, she did not look up from her wine glass, and there was absolutely no reprimand in her tone. "Though, Tessa, you could really try to be a bit more independent today. We are hosting the regional director of the bank next week, and I cannot have this medical equipment cluttering my hallway. You know how important presentation is to this family. We represent Black excellence in this community, and your constant need for accommodation ruins the aesthetic." I slowly pushed myself up, trying to balance on my good leg. "I was just going to the kitchen, Mom. I can manage perfectly fine." Before I could even take a step, DeAndre slammed his hand on the table, making the fine china rattle. "Do not talk back to our mother," he barked. He marched around the long mahogany table, his 6'2" frame moving with aggressive purpose. He wore a heavy gold watch he constantly bragged about buying with his investment fund profits. He stopped right in front of me, smelling strongly of expensive cologne and arrogance. "Let us see how disabled you really are," he sneered. With a sudden violent shove, he ripped the walker right out of my hands and hurled it across the dining room. It crashed heavily into the antique credenza, the metal frame bending with a loud, sharp crack. Without my support, gravity immediately took over. I hit the hardwood floor incredibly hard, my bad knee twisting at an unnatural angle. A sharp gasp of pain escaped my lips as the cold floor met my cheek. The room erupted. It was not an eruption of horror or concern, it was laughter. DeAndre was chuckling loudly, returning to his seat as if he had just performed a brilliant comedy routine. Even my father, Calvin, who was busy carving the turkey, simply shook his head and smirked. Then Chelsea leaned over me. Chelsea was DeAndre's white wife, who constantly paraded her performative allyship on social media while treating me like a second-class citizen behind closed doors. She knelt down beside where I lay on the floor, holding a linen napkin out to me, instead of offering her hand to help me up. Her perfectly highlighted blonde hair fell over her shoulders as she plastered on a patronizing, sympathetic smile. "Oh, honey, do you need help down there?" she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I know it is so hard for you to manage basic tasks nowadays. Here, take this napkin. You are sweating, and it is ruining your hair. I mean, I know natural hair is difficult to maintain, but yours gets so messy and wild when you get flustered. You really need to look more presentable for family dinners. Have you thought about relaxing it again, or finding a nice wig so you fit in better with the family image?" My hair was a perfectly styled silk press that I had spent hours doing that morning. Her comment was a deliberate microaggression wrapped in a ribbon of fake concern meant to belittle me, while making her look like the caring sister-in-law. My spine throbbed with white-hot agony, but I refused to let her see me cry. "I am fine, Chelsea," I said, my voice dangerously quiet as I pushed her napkin away. Calvin set down the carving knife and pointed his fork at me. "Do not snap at your sister-in-law, Tessa. She is just trying to help your miserable self. You act like a victim just because things did not go your way. Look at your brother. DeAndre manages a $20 million investment fund. He is a pillar of this community. And what do? You crunch numbers in a small cubicle somewhere. You married Julian, a low-level public defender who cannot even afford to buy you a decent house. You should have married a real man who could build an empire. I placed my palms flat on the floor, trying to lever my upper body up. I am an accountant, Dad, I said through gritted teeth. I work hard for my money. You do not even do that well, Brenda chimed in, reaching across the table for the gravy boat. If you were actually smart, you would have sued the driver who hit you in that accident. Instead, you let him settle out of court, and we had to deal with the financial burden of your recovery. Do you know how embarrassing it was to explain to our country club friends why our daughter was suddenly a burden? We paid thousands for your medical bills, and you show absolutely zero gratitude. You are just a leech on this family. That was a complete fabrication. They had not paid a single dime toward my recovery. I had paid for my own surgeries, my own physical therapy, and my own medical equipment, using my savings and my settlement money. But arguing with their rewritten history was entirely useless. They needed a villain in their perfect narrative, and my disability made me the easiest target. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood struggling to pull my bad leg underneath me. DeAndre laughed again, raising his wineglass. Look at her struggling. It is pathetic. Then the heavy oak front door swung open and the laughter died instantly. Julian stepped into the grand foyer. My husband did not look like a low-level public defender. He was immaculate, in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his presence instantly commanding the room before he even spoke a single word. He closed the door quietly behind him, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the suddenly silent house. He did not look at Calvin. He did not acknowledge Brenda. He completely ignored Chelsea and DeAndre. His dark, intense eyes locked entirely onto me lying on the floor next to my broken walker. In 2 long strides, he was beside me. He did not ask what happened or demand explanations from my family. His silence was infinitely more terrifying than all of DeAndre's loud shouting. Julian gently knelt down and wrapped his strong arms around my waist, lifting me up with a steady, effortless ease. He bore my entire weight until I could properly balance on my good leg, pulling me securely against his side. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had escaped my control. "I am fine," I breathed, resting my head against his solid chest. Julian finally turned his head, his dark eyes fixed deliberately on DeAndre. DeAndre puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his alpha male facade, but I could feel the sudden shift in the room's energy. DeAndre actually took a half step back, bumping into his chair. Julian slowly reached into his suit jacket pocket. He did not pull out a weapon or a legal document. He pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen exactly once, looked down at a notification, and then looked back up at my brother. His expression was completely devoid of emotion. "The feds froze your accounts," Julian said. 5 words spoken with the casualness of discussing the weather, but they hit the room with the force of a hurricane. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. What DeAndre choked out, his arrogant smirk melting instantly into a mask of pure confusion and rising panic. "Your hedge fund," Julian said, his voice smooth as glass. "Apex Financial just flagged 14 offshore wires originating from your primary business accounts. The United States Treasury Department froze your corporate and personal accounts exactly 4 minutes ago. You have $0, DeAndre. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now." Chelsea gasped loudly and her wineglass slipped from her trembling hand, shattering into dozens of pieces on the hardwood floor. Red wine splashed across her expensive designer shoes, but she did not even seem to notice. "That is impossible," Calvin boomed, slamming his hands on the table and standing up. "DeAndre Fund is backed by the biggest investors in Atlanta. He is fully compliant. You are lying, you jealous punk. You are just trying to ruin our Thanksgiving because you resent our success." DeAndre scrambled frantically for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice on the carpet. He snatched it up and jabbed at the screen, hastily opening his banking app. I watched the blood literally drain from his face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly gray color as he stared at the screen. He refreshed the app, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "It is locked," DeAndre stammered, his breath catching painfully in his throat. Error code 404. Federal hold. This cannot be happening. This has to be a mistake. Chelsea shrieked, grabbing DeAndre by the arm and shaking him. What does that mean, DeAndre? What did you do? You told me that money was secure. You told me the investments were clean. Shut up, Chelsea! Brenda snapped sharply, slamming her own glass down. The matriarch's eyes darted frantically around the dining room, the reality of losing her precious country club status and flawless public image hitting her faster than the speed of light. But Brenda was a ruthless survivor. She did not panic like her daughter-in-law. She pivoted with terrifying speed. Her gaze slowly turned away from her ruined golden boy and landed squarely on me. The usual disdain and annoyance in her eyes vanished completely, replaced by a predatory, calculating hunger that made my stomach churn. She smoothed down the front of her dress and forced a sickeningly sweet smile onto her face. Well, Brenda said, her voice dripping with sudden, desperate affection. Thank God you still have your grandmother, us trust fund in your name, Tessa. The silence in the dining room hung heavy and suffocating after my mother spoke. Thank God you still have your grandmother's trust fund in your name, Tessa. The words echoed off the high ceilings of the meticulously decorated room, bouncing against the crystal chandelier and the walls lined with expensive artwork that was meant to project an image of flawless success. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, unable to fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of her audacity. Just moments ago, she had watched her golden boy hurl my mobility aid across the room and watched me crash onto the hardwood floor. She had mocked my physical pain and called me a leech. Now, knowing that her son's fraudulent empire was collapsing around them, she was looking at me as if I were a walking ATM. I gripped Julian's arm tighter, stabilizing myself on my good leg, as the shock slowly morphed into a deep, simmering rage. Are you out of your mind? I asked, my voice trembling not from fear, but from absolute disgust. You just sat there and watched him physically assault me. You told me I was a burden for needing help with my medical bills. And now you want me to hand over the only financial security my grandmother left me. Brenda let out an exasperated sigh, waving her hand dismissively, as if I had just brought up a minor inconvenience. Oh, Tessa, do not be so sensitive, she chided, her tone shifting from that brief moment of desperate affection back to her usual patronizing cadence. Your brother was just frustrated. He has a lot on his plate managing such a massive portfolio. You know how stressful the financial sector can be. You are family and family forgives. Right now we have a real crisis on our hands, and we need to handle it together. That is what Black families do. We stick together and protect our legacy. Calvin nodded in agreement, stepping over the shattered remains of Chelsea's wine glass to stand beside his wife. The smell of the roasted turkey and candied yams was growing cold, mixing unpleasantly with the sharp metallic scent of spilled wine. Your mother is right, Tessa. This is bigger than your little sibling squabbles. DeAndre is the face of this family. He represents Black excellence in Atlanta. Do you know how many people look up to him in our community? Do you know what it would do to our reputation if word got out that his accounts were frozen? We cannot afford a scandal. The country club board would have a field day with this. Our entire social standing would be completely eradicated. I stared at my father, the man who had always demanded perfection and blind obedience. A scandal, I repeated the word, tasting bitter in my mouth. Dad, his accounts were not frozen because of a misunderstanding. The federal government does not freeze assets just to cause a scandal. They do it because federal crimes have been committed. It is a banking glitch. DeAndre snapped, his voice defensive but lacking its usual booming authority. He was still staring at his locked phone screen, his knuckles stark white from gripping the device so tightly. It is just some bureaucratic red tape. A compliance issue with one of our overseas partners. I just need liquid cash to satisfy my primary investors until my lawyers sort this out on Monday morning. $500,000 is nothing to me usually, but right now I need it to bridge the gap and keep the wolves at bay. You will get it back with interest once the freeze is lifted. You know I am good for it. I could not help the harsh laugh that escaped my lips. My mind, operating with the precision of a forensic investigator, immediately categorized his lies. I knew exactly which shell companies he had used in the Cayman Islands to hide the money. You think the Treasury Department puts a federal hold on a $20 million hedge fund over a simple compliance glitch? You are delusional, DeAndre. They do not flag 14 consecutive wire transfers to offshore accounts over a rounding error. Calvin slammed his fist on the dining table, rattling the heavy silver flatware. Do not disrespect your brother in this house, he thundered. You will transfer that trust fund to his account first thing tomorrow morning. Your grandmother left that money to ensure the family's stability, and right now, DeAndre is the one who needs it. What are you even doing with it anyway? You sit in your modest little house and work your boring little job. You are disabled, Tessa. It is not like you are going out and conquering the world. You do not travel, you do not network, you do not need $500,000 to sit on a couch. DeAndre has a reputation to uphold. He has a luxury lifestyle to maintain for the sake of his firm's image. The sheer cruelty of his words washed over me, but to my profound surprise, they did not break me. For years, their constant belittling of my life and my physical disability had chipped away at my self-esteem, leaving me feeling inadequate and broken. But right now, looking at their desperate, panicked faces, I realized that their cruelty was not a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their own empty, superficial souls. They valued the appearance of wealth and success over the actual safety and well-being of their own daughter. Julian stepped slightly in front of me, his tall frame shielding me from my father's aggressive posture. Calvin, I strongly suggest you lower your voice, Julian said, his tone dangerously calm and deeply resonant. You are not going to bully my wife into handing over her inheritance to fund a criminal enterprise, and you are certainly not going to speak to her that way ever again. If you raise your voice to her one more time, we are leaving, and you can deal with the federal agents entirely on your own. DeAndre lunged forward, his face twisting with unadulterated rage. Who do you think you are talking to, you broke, pathetic excuse for a lawyer? You walk into my parents' house and think you can give orders. You are a public defender, Julian. You make in an entire year what I spend on a single weekend vacation. You are nothing in this city. You do not have the power or the pedigree to stand up to me. Julian did not even flinch. He just looked at DeAndre with an expression of profound pity, a quiet strength that infuriated my brother even more. I may be a public defender, DeAndre, but at least I know I will not be waking up in a federal holding cell next week, wondering how I'm going to survive an indictment. The comment struck a massive nerve. DeAndre's chest heaved as he pointed a shaking finger right at Julian's face, his eyes wide and manic. You think you are so smart? He spat, saliva flying from his lips. You think you can come in here and threaten me? I have connections in this city, Julian. I know federal judges. I play golf with the head of the State Bar Association. If you do not make your wife sign over that money, I will make a few phone calls. I will have your law license stripped so fast your head will spin. You will never practice law in this state again. You will be completely and utterly ruined. The threat was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality of his current situation, that Julian actually smiled. A cold, sharp smile that made DeAndre falter and take a step back. You are going to ruin my career, Julian asked softly, crossing his arms over his chest. DeAndre, you do not even have access to your own checking account right now. You are entirely powerless. You cannot even afford to pay your own defense attorney, let alone bribe a judge to go after my license. This is unacceptable, Brenda shouted, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so hard, her French tips threatened to snap. Tessa, control your husband immediately. I will not have this disrespect in my dining room. We have given you everything. We provided the foundation for your life. And when you had your accident, we supported you emotionally when you had nothing else. Supported me? I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the large room, piercing through the heavy atmosphere. You told your friends I was a tragedy. You told the church congregation to pray for my poor husband who was saddled with a crippled wife. You never once came to the inpatient rehabilitation center. You never once helped me learn how to walk again. You were embarrassed that your perfect daughter was suddenly flawed. We were busy. Calvin interrupted dismissively, waving a hand through the air. Running a successful business takes time. You expect the entire world to stop because you had a setback in life. That is your problem, Tessa. You have no resilience. Now stop this foolishness and agree to the transfer. The family needs this capital to survive the week. DeAndre's entire future is at stake and you are being hopelessly selfish. I gripped the handles of my broken walker, pulling it upright, even though the frame was bent at an awkward angle. I leaned my weight onto it, feeling the cold metal pressing against my palms. I am not giving you a single cent, I said clearly, articulating every syllable so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. My grandmother left that money to me because she knew exactly what kind of people you are. She knew you would drain every single resource available to maintain your precious facade of superiority. A sudden sharp scream shattered the tension in the room. We all turned to look at Chelsea. She was gripping her long blonde hair, pulling violently at the roots, her face pale and contorted with sheer panic. She had been staring down at her phone frantically, trying to log into their various banking and high-limit credit card apps. It is all gone. Chelsea gasped, her breath coming in ragged, panicked heaves. The platinum cards are completely declined. The joint checking account is frozen. Even the private savings account for the house renovations in Buckhead. It is all frozen, DeAndre. She looked up, her eyes wide and terrified, her heavy mascara starting to run. The country club dues are processed tomorrow morning. The gala committee is expecting my $50,000 donation check on Monday. What am I supposed to tell them? That my husband is a fraud and we are penniless. Chelsea, calm down, DeAndre pleaded, reaching out to touch her arm, his voice trembling. I told you it is just a glitch. We will fix it. I just need a little time. Do not touch me, she shrieked, slapping his hand away and backing up against the wall as if he were diseased. A glitch. You said the feds froze the accounts. That is not a glitch, DeAndre. That is a full-blown criminal investigation. I did not sign up for this. I did not marry into a black family to go bankrupt and lose my social standing in this city. Do you know how hard I had to work to get those women at the club to accept me? Do you know how much I had to defend your background to my own family? Her mask had completely and utterly fallen away. The performative ally who posted constantly on social media about diversity and inclusion, who wore traditional African prints to family gatherings as a fun cultural costume, was suddenly revealing her true, deeply ingrained prejudices. In her moment of absolute financial panic, the quiet part was finally being screamed out loud for everyone to hear. Brenda gasped, her hand flying to her chest in shock. Chelsea, how dare you speak to my son that way? He gave you that lifestyle. He gave you everything you have. Oh, please, Brenda. Chelsea snapped, turning her venomous glare directly on my mother. Do not play the protective, fiercely loyal matriarch with me. We all know you only tolerate me because I look good in the family photos and help elevate your status in those elite white circles you are so incredibly desperate to break into. But I am not going down with this sinking ship. I am not going to be the pathetic wife of a convicted felon serving time in federal prison. She spun around and glared at me, her eyes narrowed into angry slits. Her chest heaved as she pointed a shaking, accusing finger in my direction. Give him the money, Tessa. Give him the damn money right now so we can fix this disaster. I stared at her, refusing to back down from her hysterical, entitled demands. Why would I give him my money to cover his federal crimes? Because you do not need it. Chelsea screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls, vibrating with absolute venom. Look at you. You are pathetic. You hobble around on that stupid metal frame looking like a broken toy. You do not go to high society galas. You do not host charity events. You do not even have a real life. You just exist in the shadows doing nothing, while we are out here actually doing things that matter to the world. DeAndre needs that cash to save our reputation, to save my reputation. You owe us your money because your life means absolutely nothing compared to ours. The sheer audacity of her entitlement hung in the air, a toxic, stifling cloud of privilege and cruelty. She genuinely believed that because my body was physically broken, my life held significantly less value than her busy social calendar. She believed that my financial security was entirely disposable if it meant preserving her designer wardrobe and her expensive country club luncheons. My parents stood there listening to their daughter-in-law hurl vicious ableist insults at their own flesh and blood, and they did absolutely nothing. They did not defend me. They did not correct her horrific behavior. In fact, Calvin was nodding slightly as if silently agreeing with Chelsea's vile assessment of my worth. Julian shifted his weight, his jaw clenched so tight I could see a muscle jumping erratically in his cheek. He was preparing to step forward to end this confrontation and pull me out of this toxic house forever. But I reached out and placed a firm hand on his chest, stopping him in his tracks. I did not need Julian to fight this battle for me. I had been preparing for this exact moment for months, gathering every piece of ammunition I needed. I straightened my posture, ignoring the sharp stabbing pain radiating from my twisted knee. I looked directly at Chelsea, watching her chest heave with indignant rage. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my tailored slacks. My fingers brushed against the crisp folded paper I had printed out earlier that morning. It was a document I had found during my extensive forensic dive into their financial web. A web so tangled and corrupt that it took weeks of late-night decryption tracing offshore accounts and dummy corporations to fully unravel. I pulled the paper out and slowly, deliberately unfolded it, smoothing the deep creases with my thumb. "Bail him out," I asked, my voice echoing with a chilling absolute calm that brought the room to a standstill. I took a step forward, leaning heavily on the bent frame of my walker, holding the paper out so the harsh dining room chandelier illuminated the bold black ink of the bank statement. "Bail him out with what, Chelsea?" "With the $150,000 you embezzled from the Community Church Scholarship Fund to buy your designer bags." The silence in the dining room stretched so thin, it felt like it might snap and take off someone else's head. Chelsea stared at the printed bank statement in my hand, and for a single suspended second, the absolute truth was written all over her face. The aggressive, patronizing woman, who had just called my life meaningless, simply vanished. In her place stood a cornered animal, calculating her next survival tactic. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her perfectly applied blush looking harsh and clownish against her pale skin. "I do not know what you are talking about," Chelsea stammered, her voice suddenly high-pitched and fragile. I did not move an inch. I kept the paper held out, steadying myself against the bent frame of my walker. "The paper outlines 3 separate electronic transfers, Chelsea," I said, my voice dead calm. Each transfer was for exactly $50,000. They were routed directly from the Community Church Youth Outreach Fund, the fund my parents trust you to manage, into a private limited liability company registered under your maiden name in Delaware. You moved the money the same week you bought that vintage Hermes Birkin bag you are so proud of, and the same month you upgraded your luxury SUV. You stole money meant for underprivileged kids to fund your country club aesthetic. Chelsea's bottom lip began to quiver. She took a step back, bumping into the dining chair, and suddenly her eyes filled with tears. It was a masterful, instantaneous transformation. The weaponization of her tears was something I had witnessed before, but never with such desperate high stakes. "She is attacking me." "Brenda?" Chelsea cried, her voice breaking into a perfectly calibrated sob. She turned to my mother, her hands shaking as she pressed them against her chest. "I do not understand why she hates me so much. I have tried so hard to be a part of this family, to respect your culture and your traditions. I have bent over backwards to include Tessa, but she is just so bitter. She hacked into my private files and doctored these documents because she is jealous of my marriage to DeAndre. She wants to destroy the only good thing her brother has." I watched the performance with a mixture of awe and absolute disgust. She was leaning entirely into her perceived fragility, playing the victimized innocent woman being aggressively targeted by the angry, bitter, disabled black woman. She knew exactly which societal scripts to trigger, and she knew exactly who her audience was. Brenda looked at the paper in my hand, and then looked at her weeping daughter-in-law. I saw the rapid calculation happening behind my mother's eyes. Brenda knew Chelsea was lying. She knew my skills as a forensic accountant were flawless. She knew I would never fabricate a financial document. But Brenda was also the head of the church finance committee. If word got out that her own daughter-in-law had embezzled $150,000 from the congregation, their social standing would be annihilated. The community they had spent 3 decades trying to impress would turn their backs on them overnight. The shame would be insurmountable. In that crucial, terrifying moment, my mother made a choice. She chose the preservation of her false empire over the truth. She chose the corrupt white daughter-in-law over her own flesh and blood. "Put that garbage away, Tessa," Brenda commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. I stared at her, my heart hammering painfully against my ribs. "Mom, you are looking at proof of a federal crime. She stole from our own community." "I said put it away," Brenda snapped, slamming her hand onto the table. "How dare you bring stolen, fabricated trash into my dining room on Thanksgiving? Chelsea comes from the Montgomery family. Her father introduced DeAndre to the Regional Investment Board. She brought legitimate wealth and connections into this house. She is the reason your brother gets invited to the exclusive galas in Buckhead. She maintains the high society image of this family while you do nothing but drag us down with your miserable attitude and your constant need for special treatment." I felt a coldness spread through my chest, freezing the last remaining drop of daughterly affection I held for this woman. "You are defending a thief?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly. "You would rather protect a woman who steals from children than hold your own son and his wife accountable." Calvin stepped forward, his large frame blocking my view of Chelsea. He pointed a thick warning finger directly at my face. "You listen to me very carefully, Tessa. You have always been a problem. Ever since that accident, you have walked around with a chip on your shoulder, expecting the world to cater to your every whim. DeAndre and Chelsea are building a legacy. They are creating generational wealth. If there is an accounting discrepancy in the church ledger, I will cover it quietly from my personal accounts. We will handle it internally like a strong, united family. But we will not allow you to tear down your brother's wife out of spite." "A discrepancy," I repeated incredulously. "Dad, she did not misplace a decimal point. She deliberately wired funds across state lines to hide stolen money. That is wire fraud. And DeAndre's accounts are frozen right now because he is doing the exact same thing on a massive corporate scale. They are criminals." Chelsea let out a loud, theatrical wail, burying her face in DeAndre's shoulder. "Make her stop, DeAndre. Make her leave me alone. I cannot take this kind of abuse in my own home." "It is my house, Chelsea," Brenda barked fiercely, but her anger was directed entirely at me. "And she is leaving right now." Brenda marched around the table, her expensive silk dress swishing against the floorboards. She stopped 2 feet away from me, her eyes blazing with an irrational, terrifying fury. "Give me that paper, Tessa," Brenda demanded, holding out her hand. "Give me the document and give me whatever hard drive or computer you used to find it. You are going to delete everything. You are going to fix whatever mess you caused with the bank, and then you are going to get out of my house. You are no longer welcome here. You are not my daughter. You are a traitor to your own blood." The rejection hit me like a physical blow, but the pain was quickly swallowed by a rising tide of righteous indignation. I gripped my walker tightly, refusing to hand over the statement. "You are choosing them over me?" I asked, needing to hear her say it clearly. "You are throwing your disabled daughter out onto the street to protect 2 people who have lied to you, stolen from you, and insulted you. They are successful." Brenda spat, her face contorted with a vicious, elitist pride. "They are winners. You are just a broken, jealous girl who cannot stand to see anyone else shine. Give me the paper now before I take it from you." Brenda took a threatening step forward, her hand raised slightly. That was when Julian finally moved. My husband stepped effortlessly between my mother and me, his tall, athletic build completely dwarfing Brenda's frame. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, an immovable physical barrier protecting me from my own mother. And then Julian laughed. It was not a warm laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a cold, dark, terrifying sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the dining room. It was the laugh of a man who spent his life in criminal courtrooms, systematically destroying arrogant prosecutors and corrupt witnesses. It was a laugh that made Calvin freeze in his tracks and caused Chelsea to suddenly stop her fake crying. "I strongly advise you to take a step back, Brenda," Julian said, his voice dangerously smooth and entirely devoid of respect. "Do not speak to my wife that way," Calvin bellowed, stepping forward to defend his matriarch. "You are a guest in this house, Julian. You are a public defender who makes a fraction of what I make. You do not give orders here." Julian turned his cold gaze to my father. "You are right, Calvin. I am a public defender, which means I spend 40 to 50 hours a week dealing with federal and state criminal statutes. I know the penal code backward and forward. I know exactly how ambitious prosecutors build their cases, and I know exactly what it sounds like when arrogant, wealthy people mistakenly believe their money puts them above the law." Julian slowly buttoned the center button of his suit jacket, projecting absolute authority. "Let me explain what just happened in this dining room over the last 5 minutes so you completely understand the precarious nature of your current freedom." He looked directly at Brenda, his eyes narrowing. "My wife, an officer of the court and a federally licensed forensic investigator, just presented you with physical documentary evidence of a felony. She informed you that your daughter-in-law committed wire fraud and embezzlement, which are federal crimes under Title 18 United States Code Section 1343. Julian took a slow, measured step toward my parents, forcing them both to instinctively step backward. Instead of contacting the authorities or confronting the suspect, Julian continued, his voice ringing with legal precision. "You, Calvin, openly stated your intention to use personal funds to quietly cover up the stolen church money. And you, Brenda, actively demanded that the lead investigator hand over the evidence so you could destroy it. You also demanded that she illegally hack a banking system to unfreeze funds tied to a separate federal investigation." The dining room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. DeAndre was staring at Julian with wide, panicked eyes, finally realizing that his threats from earlier were completely hollow against a man who actually knew the law. "Do you know what the federal government calls that, Brenda?" Julian asked, tilting his head slightly. "They do not call it protecting the family legacy. They call it conspiracy to conceal a federal crime. They call it acting as an accessory after the fact. They call it tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice." Julian smiled, a predatory, terrifying smile. If Tessa wanted to, she could walk out that door right now, make one phone call to her supervisor at the agency, and have both of you indicted by Monday morning. You would not just lose your country club membership, Brenda. You would lose your freedom. I have seen women your age in federal holding cells. They do not care about your silk dresses or your mega-church status in there. They will strip search you, take away your jewelry, and lock you in an 8x10 concrete box. Brenda's face turned a horrific shade of purple. The sheer humiliation of being spoken to like a common criminal by a man she viewed as beneath her social class broke whatever fragile grip she still had on her sanity. Her chest heaved with ragged, furious breaths. She was so blinded by her obsession with respectability and control that Julian's legal warnings simply bounced off her rage. "You think you can come into my house and threaten me?" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking with unhinged fury. "You think you can use big legal words to intimidate us? We are the Addams family. We built this community. We own this town. You are nothing but a poor, arrogant boy who married my worthless daughter for a free meal." Brenda lunged forward, her arm swinging back with blinding speed, aiming a vicious, open-handed slap directly at my face. She wanted to physically punish me for bringing this reality into her pristine home. She wanted to strike me down for breaking the illusion of her perfect life. I braced myself, gripping the walker, preparing for the impact. Julian moved to intercept her arm, his reflexes sharp and ready. But before Brenda's hand could connect with either of us, the entire house shuddered. Boom. 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 The sound was deafening. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or the steady rhythm of a police officer. It was the violent, heavy pounding of a closed fist striking the solid oak of our front door with enough force to make the dining room windows rattle in their frames. Brenda froze, her hands suspended in the air. Calvin turned toward the foyer, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. DeAndre let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, backing away from the windows and pulling Chelsea along with him. The heavy pounding echoed again, louder and more desperate this time. The glass panes surrounding the front door shook violently. DeAndre, where is our money? A rough, aggressive voice muffled by the thick wood yelled from the front porch. Open the damn door, DeAndre. We know you are in there with your rich family. You promised us our return today. We are not leaving without our $2 million. The blood drained from Calvin's face. He looked at his golden boy, his perfect, successful son, who was now cowering behind a dining room chair, shivering like a frightened child. DeAndre Calvin whispered, his voice thick with sudden, terrifying realization. Who is at my front door? These were not federal agents conducting a white-collar audit. These were not lawyers coming to serve a subpoena. These were the men DeAndre had turned to when his legitimate investors started asking questions. These were the dangerous, violent men who did not care about offshore accounts or federal freezes. They only cared about their cash, and they had come to collect it in person. The heavy oak front door did not just swing open, it splintered inward with a violent crack that sent chunks of expensive wood flying across the polished marble tiles of the grand foyer. The sheer force of the impact made Brenda release a high, thin shriek that was instantly swallowed by the cold November wind rushing into the pristine house. 3 men walked through the ruined entryway. They were not wearing ski masks or holding crowbars. They wore immaculate dark suits and moved with a terrifying, unhurried precision that screamed of professional violence. The man in the center casually brushed a piece of splintered wood from his dark lapel. He stepped over the threshold, his heavy leather shoes leaving muddy tracks on Brenda U.S. prized Persian rug. He looked around the dining room, taking in the lavish Thanksgiving spread, the shattered wine glass on the floor, and the completely terrified faces of my family. The facade of black excellence, of untouched wealth and high society grace shattered into a million irreparable pieces in that single moment. You have been avoiding our phone calls, DeAndre, the man said, his voice deep and smooth, carrying no anger at all, just an absolute chilling certainty. We do not like being avoided. DeAndre was visibly shaking. The arrogant $20 million hedge fund manager, the self-proclaimed pillar of the community, was currently cowering behind a high-backed dining chair. His knuckles were stark white as he gripped the carved wood, and I could actually hear his breath rattling in his chest. Look, I can explain, DeAndre stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. The accounts are just tied up right now. It is a federal hold. I just need until Monday morning to clear the compliance issues. I have your $2 million. It is completely safe, I swear to you. The man in the center smiled, a cold, dead expression that did not reach his eyes. We know about the federal hold, DeAndre. We have our own people inside Apex Financial. We know the feds froze your assets 4 minutes ago. What we want to know is where you routed our specific funds before the freeze hit, because we know you moved $2 million into a shadow account yesterday afternoon. And we are not leaving this house without the routing numbers and the access codes. Calvin suddenly found his voice. My father puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the booming patriarchal authority he used to dominate boardrooms and church finance committees. Now listen here, gentlemen, Calvin commanded, taking a step forward. You have broken into my home. I am Calvin Adams. We are a prominent family in this city, and I demand that you leave my property before I call the chief of police, who happens to be a personal friend of mine. The man on the left moved so fast I barely registered the motion. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the distance between the foyer and the dining table. He grabbed Calvin by the collar of his expensive cashmere sweater and slammed him violently backwards against the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of my father instantly. The framed family portraits hanging above the wainscoting rattled against the drywall. We do not care who you play golf with, old man, the thug whispered, leaning in incredibly close to my father's face. Your son stole our money. If he does not give it back right now, we are going to start breaking things in this pretty house, starting with the people in it. Brenda pressed her hands over her mouth, sinking lower into her chair and refusing to look at her husband pinned against the wall. The illusion of their untouchable status was entirely gone. They were completely powerless. Chelsea, who had been backed against the far wall near the kitchen entrance, saw an opportunity. While the men were focused on Calvin and DeAndre, she slowly began inching her way toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen and the back patio. She had kicked off her ruined designer shoes and was moving silently, her wide eyes fixed on the exit. She was completely willing to abandon her husband and his entire family to save her own skin. She pushed the swinging door open just a fraction of an inch. "Going somewhere?" the third man asked, stepping out from the shadows of the hallway. He had flanked the dining room while everyone was distracted. He reached out and grabbed Chelsea roughly by the fabric of her expensive silk dress, yanking her backward. Chelsea let out a piercing shriek, stumbling and falling hard onto the floor beside the dining table. She scrambled backward away from the man, sobbing hysterically and pulling her knees to her chest. "Please," Chelsea begged, her voice thick with pure panic. "I do not have anything to do with this. I did not know what he was doing. Take him. Just let me go. I am not part of this." The lead man in the center ignored her pathetic pleas. He turned his attention entirely back to my brother. "Time is up, DeAndre. The codes. Now. Or my associate is going to break your father's jaw." DeAndre looked at his father struggling against the wall. He looked at his wife crying on the floor. He looked at his mother frozen in absolute terror. And then his frantic, desperate eyes landed squarely on me. I watched the gears turning in his head. He had no access to the money. He could not give them the codes because the federal government had locked everything down. He needed a way out. He needed a sacrifice. He needed someone else to take the blame so he could survive the night. "It was her," DeAndre screamed suddenly, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. The entire room froze. Even the thug holding Calvin turned his head in confusion. DeAndre stepped out from behind the chair, his finger still aimed like a weapon at me. "She did it," he yelled, his voice rising in pitch, fueled by pure cowardice and desperate self-preservation. "Tessa is my accountant. She handles all the back-end wire transfers. I do not know the access codes because she is the one who set up the shadow accounts. She moved your money yesterday." I stared at my brother, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. I expected him to be selfish, but the absolute depravity of throwing me to these violent men was staggering. "She has all the encrypted files on her computer," DeAndre continued, lying with a terrifying rapid speed. "She is the only one who can access your funds. Take her. She is disabled. She cannot run. She cannot fight back. Just take her and get the money from her." The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. The lead thug slowly turned his gaze toward me. He looked at my twisted leg. He looked at the bent and broken walker I was leaning against for support. He was evaluating me, assessing whether DeAndre's frantic claim made any logical sense. I did not look at the men. I looked past them, straight at my parents. Surely my father would object. Surely my mother, the woman who gave birth to me, would scream at DeAndre for offering his disabled sister as a human shield to a group of violent criminals. I waited for them to defend me. I waited for them to say absolutely anything. Calvin, who was still pinned against the wall, slowly nodded his head. I felt a physical pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my spinal injury. My father was nodding. He was actively agreeing with the lie. "It is true," Calvin gasped out, his face pale and sweating. "She manages the numbers. DeAndre is just the face of the company. Tessa does all the routing." Brenda refused to meet my eyes. She stared fixedly at the center spread of the dining table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was silently sacrificing me. They were completely willing to let these men drag their disabled daughter out of the house and do whatever they wanted to me, as long as their golden boy, their perfect, successful son, was spared. Julian moved instantly. My husband stepped squarely in front of me, blocking their view of me entirely. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, his entire body coiled with protective tension. "If any of you take one step closer to my wife," Julian said, his voice dangerously low and resonant, "you will not leave this house walking." The lead thug smirked. He gestured with his head, and the man who had caught Chelsea stepped up beside him, two of them against Julian. The man holding Calvin shoved my father aside and drew a heavy black firearm from inside his jacket, letting it hang casually at his side. The threat was clear and absolute. Julian was strong and capable, but he was outmatched and unarmed. "Julian, do not," I whispered, placing a hand on his back. I could feel his muscles tight as coiled steel under his suit jacket. The lead man stepped up right to the edge of Julian's personal space. "Move aside, lawyer," the man ordered calmly. "We just want the girl and the codes. No one has to get hurt if she cooperates." Julian did not budge an inch. "I will kill you before I let you touch her," Julian promised. The man sighed as if this were just a tedious interruption to his day. He suddenly reached out, pushing past Julian's shoulder with brutal force. Julian grabbed the man's arm, twisting it sharply, but the thug with the gun stepped forward, raising the heavy weapon toward Julian's head. "Stop," I said, stepping out from behind Julian's protective cover. I leaned heavily on the bent frame of my walker, forcing myself to stand as tall as possible despite the agonizing pain in my knee. The lead man wrenched his arm free from Julian and took a step toward me. He looked down at me with cold, empty eyes. He did not see a person. He only saw an obstacle between him and his $2 million. He reached out and wrapped his large, thick hand around the metal frame of my walker. With a violent yank, he pulled the walker toward him. I lost my balance, pitching forward slightly, but Julian caught my arm, steadying me before I could hit the floor again. The man held my walker in his left hand and slowly raised his right fist, pulling it back as if preparing to strike me directly across the face. "Give me the routing numbers right now," the man demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying growl. "Or I will beat them out of you right here in front of your family." DeAndre watched from the corner, a sick look of relief washing over his face. He had successfully deflected the danger. He had saved himself. Calvin and Brenda watched in absolute silence, letting it happen. I looked at the raised fist. I looked at the cold, dead eyes of the man threatening me. I did not cower. I did not scream for help. I did not shed a single tear. The betrayal of my parents and my brother had burned away every ounce of fear left in my body, leaving behind nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I let go of Julian's arm, balancing purely on my own strength, ignoring the searing pain in my spine. I slowly raised my left wrist. I tapped the screen of my smartwatch exactly twice. A small green light illuminated on the face of the watch, confirming the silent signal had been successfully transmitted. I lowered my arm and looked the man dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of emotion. "Are you sure you want to assault the lead investigator for the Federal Trade Commission, gentlemen?" The large man holding my walker stopped mid-swing. The air in the dining room grew so thick you could practically cut it with a knife. The thug lowered his fist, his dead eyes suddenly darting toward my wrist and then back to my face. The man with the gun, who was still pinning my father against the floral wallpaper, shifted his weight, looking visibly uncertain. Criminals who dealt in black market loans and broken kneecaps were terrifying, but they were also incredibly pragmatic. They knew how to handle rival gangs and desperate debtors who fell behind on their payments. But assaulting a federal agent was an entirely different game. It was a guaranteed one-way ticket to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. They knew it, and I knew it. DeAndre let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh that sounded like scraping metal. He stepped out from behind the heavy dining chair, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. "Do not listen to her," DeAndre scoffed, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "She is lying. She is completely out of her mind. She is just a low-level bookkeeper. She crunches basic numbers for a tiny local firm. She is disabled, for crying out loud. Does she look like a federal investigator to you? Look at her. She can barely stand up straight. She is just trying to scare you so you will leave our house. Get the access codes from her. She has them. I swear to you, she is holding out on us." I did not break eye contact with the lead thug. I did not flinch or cower. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small, heavy titanium block. It was a specialized, highly encrypted solid-state drive issued by the federal government. I tossed it underhanded toward the long mahogany table. It sailed through the air and landed right in the center of the massive roasted turkey platter, splashing dark gravy and cranberry sauce across Brenda U.S. fine antique china. The metallic thud echoed loudly in the incredibly quiet room. "I am not a bookkeeper, DeAndre," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the destroyed dining room, cutting through his pathetic lies. "I am a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier government contractor, working directly with the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. I do not do simple taxes. I do not balance petty cash ledgers. I dismantle complex, fraudulent financial networks for a living. And your network, DeAndre, was embarrassingly easy to dismantle. It was amateur hour from the very beginning." DeAndre stared at the hard drive sitting in a pool of gravy, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from the drive to my face, his arrogant superiority finally cracking under the weight of his own profound stupidity. I shifted my weight on my good leg, standing as tall as possible, gripping the bent handles of my broken walker. "You thought you were so incredibly smart, routing your investors' capital through anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Belize. You used a layered routing protocol, masking the IP addresses, thinking no one would ever trace the origin accounts back to your primary hedge fund in downtown Atlanta. But you got sloppy, DeAndre. You got arrogant and you got lazy. You used the exact same digital signature on the dummy corporate charters that you used to sign your residential mortgage documents. You transferred $2 million of unverified capital through a proxy firm in Delaware just yesterday afternoon, trying frantically to hide the dirty money before your quarterly compliance audit." I pointed a steady finger at the drive sitting on the turkey platter. "Every single transaction, every hidden offshore wire transfer, every forged compliance document, and every illegal kickback is on that drive. I know exactly how much money you stole. I know exactly who you stole it from. And I know exactly where you tried to hide it. I spent the last 8 months tracking every single dime you moved. I know about the fake real estate investments. I know about the phantom tech startups you funded with stolen capital. I know it all." The lead thug slowly let go of my walker, as if the metal frame had suddenly turned burning hot. He took a long step back, his eyes narrowing as he looked at DeAndre. The man holding my father lowered his weapon completely, his expression shifting rapidly from aggressive violence to profound self-preservation. They were violent men, but they were not stupid. They understood exactly what my words meant. I was the one who submitted the final forensic audit to the federal task force at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I continued, my voice rising with absolute, undeniable authority. "I am the reason your accounts were frozen. I sat in my small office making my modest salary, watching you parade around this city, pretending to be a self-made titan of industry, while you were actively defrauding your clients and funding a fake luxury lifestyle. I built the entire criminal case against you, DeAndre. And the exact moment I hit submit, the Department of Justice authorized a full asset freeze on everything you own." The thug holding Calvin let go of my father, letting the older man slide down the wall until he hit the floor. The thug looked at his boss and nodded toward the front door. "We need to get out of here right now," the thug said, his voice tight with rising panic. "This guy is radioactive." The lead man turned his massive frame toward DeAndre. The cold professional menace was gone, entirely replaced by pure, furious panic. "You absolute idiot!" the lead man spat, taking a threatening step toward my brother. "You brought the feds right to our doorstep. You took our money and you put us directly in the crosshairs of a massive federal investigation. You used our capital to play your stupid little rich boy games." "No, please!" DeAndre begged, holding up his trembling hands and backing into the antique credenza until the wood groaned behind him. "I can fix it. I can get your money back. Just give me a few days to talk to my lawyers. I have assets. I have properties. I can liquidate everything." The lead man spat on the expensive hardwood floor right near DeAndre U.S. custom Italian leather shoes. "We are not touching you." The man snarled, his upper lip curling in disgust. If the feds are already freezing your accounts, they are probably sitting in unmarked vans outside this house right now. They probably have wiretaps on your phones. You are a dead man, DeAndre. You just do not know it yet. We are completely done with you. Without another word, the three men turned and sprinted for the ruined front door. They did not care about collecting their debt anymore. They only cared about avoiding federal racketeering charges. They practically trampled each other to get out of the destroyed entryway, leaving muddy footprints and shattered oak splinters in their frantic wake. A few seconds later, we heard the loud screeching tires of their heavy black SUV peeling out of the circular driveway, abandoning my brother entirely to his inevitable fate. The silence they left behind was heavy and ringing in my ears. The smell of the roasted turkey and the candied yams still hung in the air, a sickening contrast to the absolute devastation unfolding around the dining table. The beautiful Thanksgiving spread that Brenda had spent days agonizing over now looked like the aftermath of a war zone. Gravy was slowly dripping off the edges of the titanium hard drive, soaking into the pristine white linen tablecloth. The shattered crystal wine glass Chelsea had dropped earlier glittered sharply against the polished wood floor, catching the light from the extravagant chandelier overhead. Every single element of their perfect, wealthy aesthetic had been tainted by the ugly truth of their profound corruption. DeAndre stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the empty doorway where his doom had just departed. His perfect custom-tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his shrinking, pathetic frame. He looked down at the hardwood floor at the exact spot where I had crashed onto the wood just a short time ago. The spot where he had laughed at my pain and mocked my disability. Slowly, his knees buckled. DeAndre collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing exactly where he had shoved me. He grabbed his short hair, pulling at the roots violently, just like Chelsea had done earlier, sobbing pathetically into the quiet, ruined dining room. His entire $20 million empire, his carefully crafted reputation, his arrogant superiority had been completely dismantled by the sister he had mocked and belittled his entire life. He was no longer the towering alpha male who had violently ripped my walker from my hands. He was reduced to a sniveling coward rocking back and forth in the wreckage of his own making, muttering unintelligible pleas to the empty air, hoping for a miracle that was absolutely never going to come. The federal government did not grant miracles to men who stole millions of dollars to buy custom-tailored suits and exotic sports cars. Chelsea, who was still on the floor, scrambled to her feet, not looking at her husband at all. She did not offer him a single word of comfort. She grabbed her expensive designer purse and ran frantically for the back door, slipping out into the cold night air to save herself, completely abandoning the family she had praised so highly just an hour ago. She was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, leaving her husband crying on the floor. Calvin groaned softly from his place, slumped against the floral wallpaper, his hands clutching his knees. He looked 20 years older, his face sagging with the crushing weight of public ruin. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew the news vans would be parked at the end of their long, winding driveway by sunrise. He knew the church congregation would whisper about them on Sunday morning. The legacy of black excellence he had preached about so fiercely was now nothing more than a cautionary tale of greed and spectacular failure. The patriarch of the family, the man who demanded excellence and perfection, was entirely broken, unable to process the absolute destruction of his legacy. But Brenda was not done. The matriarch of the family, the woman who valued public image and social standing above absolutely everything else, refused to accept this defeat. She looked at DeAndre crying miserably on the floor, and then she looked directly at me. Her eyes were completely unhinged, wild with a desperate, terrifying denial. She could not accept that her perfect world was over. She lunged. She moved faster than anyone expected, crossing the room and grabbing the collar of my silk blouse with both hands. Her expensive manicured nails dug painfully into my collarbone as she shook me violently. "You can fix this!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking and echoing wildly in the high-ceilinged dining room. Her breath smelled heavily of stale wine and pure panic. "You are the investigator. You have the files. You can delete them, Tessa. You can log into their secure system and erase the audit. You can tell your bosses it was a massive mistake. You can say your math was wrong. Mom, let go of me, I said firmly, refusing to struggle against her frantic grip, planting my feet solidly on the floor. No, Brenda shrieked, shaking me again harder this time, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. You are my daughter. You owe us. We gave you life. You cannot let them take him away. If he goes to federal prison, they will seize everything. They will take this beautiful house. They will take our retirement accounts. Our friends at the country club will turn their backs on us. We will be laughingstocks in this city. We will have absolutely nothing left. You cannot do this to your own family. You have to save us, Tessa. You are going to walk over to that table, pick up that little metal box, and smash it. You are going to protect your brother. You are going to do what I tell you to do because you are a part of this family. We do not turn on our own. We protect our blood. If you do not fix this right now, Tessa, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable life. I will ruin you. Julian stepped forward immediately, his large hand reaching out to forcefully remove Brenda's violent grip from my clothing, but I held my left hand up, stopping him once again. I did not need to be rescued. I looked at my mother, seeing the absolute terror in her eyes, the complete and utter destruction of her false reality. I saw the ugly, selfish truth of a woman who would gladly force her disabled daughter to commit a felony just to keep her fancy house and her country club luncheons. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me, completely neutralizing the frantic energy Brenda was throwing at me. I reached up and gently, but with absolute unyielding strength, peeled her fingers off my silk collar one by one. She tried to hold on, but the sheer surprise of my physical resistance made her falter. I pushed her hands away entirely and smoothed the fabric of my blouse, standing perfectly still. You cannot ruin me, Mom, I said, my voice soft, but echoing with finality in the quiet room. You never had the power to ruin me. You only had the power to make me feel small, and I am done feeling small. I am not deleting anything. I am not smashing that drive. And I am certainly not going to federal prison to save a man who threw me on the floor and mocked my broken body. Brenda stared at me, her mouth opening in a silent scream of denial. The federal agents will be here in less than 10 minutes. I continued, turning my gaze to take in Calvin on the floor and DeAndre weeping beside him. I suggest you call a very good defense attorney, and I suggest you do it before they put the handcuffs on you. I stood my ground, feeling the weight of the moment, knowing the drive sat safely on the turkey platter, feeling the solid, reassuring presence of Julian standing right behind me, and feeling the undeniable power of my own absolute truth. I looked at the woman who had called me a burden, who had watched me fall, who had tried to steal my inheritance to fund a lie. I just smiled. My smile broke something fundamental inside my mother. The furious, demanding matriarch suddenly vanished, and in her place, a completely different character emerged. Brenda dropped heavily to her knees, the expensive silk of her dress pooling around her on the stained hardwood floor. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, her face twisting into a mask of desperate, manufactured piety. The sudden shift from violent rage to weeping victimhood gave me emotional whiplash, but I kept my posture rigid. Tessa, please, Brenda begged, her voice trembling with heavy theatrical tears. The Lord commands us to honor our father and mother. We are your blood, Tessa. We are the family that raised you in the church, that taught you the difference between right and wrong. You have a God-given gift with computers and numbers. You can use that gift right now to save us. God is testing our family today, and He placed you here to be our savior. You know the federal systems. You know how these banks operate. Just log in and divert the funds. Move the money around so the government does not see it. Erase the audit. Do whatever you have to do to protect our home. You cannot let them take our estate, Tessa. This house is our entire legacy. It is everything we have built. Calvin scrambled up from the floor where he had been slumped. His face was gray and covered in a thick sheen of cold sweat, but he tried to summon his old booming voice of authority. He pointed a trembling finger at me, ignoring the fact that his son was still weeping on the floor like a broken child. Listen to your mother, Tessa, Calvin commanded, though his voice shook pitifully. We are the Addams family. We have a reputation in this city that spans 3 decades. I have worked my fingers to the bone to provide you children with a life of luxury and privilege. This estate is the ultimate symbol of our success. If the federal government seizes this property, the shame will kill your mother. The country club board will strip our membership by the end of the week. Our friends will pretend they do not know us. You owe us this favor. You owe me for the life I gave you. You need to hack into that system right now and stop the seizure of this property. I stared at the two of them, listening to them twist religion and family loyalty into a weapon to force me into committing a federal felony. They were not asking me to help them understand the law. They were demanding that I risk my own freedom, my career, and my entire future just to maintain their fake high society aesthetic. They did not care if I went to prison as long as they could still host their lavish dinner parties and brag to their friends about their massive suburban estate. Julian stepped forward again, the polished floorboards creaking slightly under his weight. He did not look angry anymore. He looked incredibly bored, like a teacher explaining a very simple concept to exceptionally slow students. He walked over to the dining table, carefully avoiding the spilled gravy and the shattered crystal. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on the only clean section of the mahogany wood. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches opening sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. Julian slowly reached inside the briefcase. He did not pull out a legal brief or a defense strategy. He pulled out a thick stack of official-looking documents bound at the top by a heavy blue legal cover. He tossed the stack casually onto the table, right next to the ruined turkey platter and the encrypted hard drive. "She cannot take the house from you, Calvin," Julian said, his voice cutting through the heavy air with surgical precision. Calvin blinked, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "What are you talking about, Julian? If Tessa does not reverse the audit, the feds are going to seize this property to pay off DeAndre Yu's stolen capital. They are going to take my home." Julian shook his head slowly, a cold, hard smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The federal government has absolutely no interest in this property, Calvin. They cannot seize it to pay for your son's U.S. crimes because you do not own it anymore. The bank already took it from you 3 months ago when you secretly mortgaged the entire estate to the absolute limit just to pay off DeAndre's earlier debts." The silence that slammed into the dining room was absolute. It was a silence so heavy and complete that it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the space. Brenda stopped her theatrical crying immediately. Her hand slowly lowered from her chest as she turned her head to look at her husband. Her eyes were wide, uncomprehending saucers of pure shock. "What did he just say, Calvin?" Brenda whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "What is he talking about?" Calvin's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an exit, a lie, an excuse, anything to save him from the absolute destruction of his reality. Julian tapped the heavy blue document on the table. "It is all public record if you know where to look, Brenda. Your husband took out a massive second and third mortgage on this property over a year ago. DeAndre's hedge fund was already bleeding money back then, and Calvin quietly drained all of your personal equity to keep the boy afloat. He hid the notices from you. He intercepted the mail. He forged your signature on the loan documents to push it through quickly. But DeAndre just burned through that money too. Calvin defaulted on the loans 4 months ago. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings quietly to avoid a public scene, but the final auction happened exactly 2 weeks ago." Brenda let out a sound that was not entirely human. It was a raw, guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated agony. She scrambled up from her knees, grabbing the edge of the dining table for support. She lunged toward Calvin, her manicured hands curled into claws. "You mortgaged the house!" Brenda screamed, hitting him weakly in the chest as Calvin cowered against the wall. "You gave away my home. You forged my signature. You told me we were fine. You told me the business was thriving. You gave everything we had to this worthless boy, and you left us with nothing." Calvin tried to grab her wrists, his face crumbling into a mask of pathetic defeat. "I was trying to save him, Brenda. He told me he just needed a bridge loan. He told me the market was going to rebound. I had to protect my son. I had to protect our legacy." "You destroyed our legacy." Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. We are homeless, Calvin. We have nothing. The country club, the church, the charities, it is all gone. Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do? The scene unfolding before me was the complete and total collapse of the Addams family empire. DeAndre was still curled on the floor, weeping into his hands, knowing he was going to federal prison. Calvin was pinned against the wall by his hysterical wife, his pride and his arrogance completely stripped away. Brenda was hyperventilating, her perfect hair ruined, her expensive dress, stained, grasping desperately at the ghost of a life that no longer existed. They had built their entire world on a foundation of lies and appearance, and now the ground had completely given way beneath them. They were experiencing the exact terror and helplessness they had tried to inflict on me for years. They were finally realizing that their social status could not protect them from the consequences of their own toxic choices. I leaned heavily on my bent walker, feeling the cold metal pressing into my palms. My spine ached and my bad knee throbbed with a dull, persistent agony. But I had never felt stronger in my entire life. I looked at the people who had brought me into this world, the people who had called me a tragedy, who had treated me like a burden, who had just ordered me to pack my bags and leave because I refused to cover up a felony. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the rubber stoppers of my walker squeaking slightly against the hardwood floor. Brenda heard the sound and turned her head toward me. Her face was streaked with running makeup, her eyes wild and frantic. She looked at me, not with maternal love, but with the desperate, calculating hunger of a drowning woman looking for a raft. Tessa, Brenda gasped, reaching a shaking hand out toward me. You have to help us. You have that trust fund from your grandmother. You can buy us a new house. You can rent us a luxury condo in the city until your father gets back on his feet. You are our daughter. You cannot just leave us on the street. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no obligation. The familial bond they had tried to weaponize against me had been completely severed by their own cruelty. I am not renting you a condo, Mom, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. And I am not buying you a new house. Calvin wiped his sweating forehead, his chest heaving. You have $500,000 sitting in an account, Tessa. You are going to watch your parents become homeless when you have the power to stop it. What kind of monster are you? I smiled, a slow, genuine smile that made Calvin shrink back against the floral wallpaper. I do not have $500,000 sitting in an account anymore, Dad, I said, my voice ringing clearly through the destroyed dining room. I spent it. Brenda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. You spent it. On what? How could you spend that kind of money? I shifted my weight, leaning forward slightly on the walker. I looked directly into my mother's panicked, tear-filled eyes. I bought a house, I said simply. Julian reached over and flipped open the blue cover of the legal documents sitting on the dining table. He turned the deed around so it faced my parents. The bold black ink at the top of the page listed the official transfer of the property. I looked down at the two people who had just tried to throw me out on the street. I looked at the golden boy sobbing on the floor. I looked at the shattered remains of their fake perfect life, and the anonymous buyer who paid cash at the foreclosure auction to keep you from being thrown on the street today. I asked, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the room. That was the disabled daughter you just told to pack her bags. The absolute silence in the dining room shattered like a pane of glass dropping onto solid concrete. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward until her hip collided hard with the edge of the mahogany table. Her eyes darted frantically from the legal deed resting in Julian, a steady hand to my face, and back again, completely unable to process the reality that her entire existence now belonged to the daughter she had always treated like a disposable afterthought. Calvin stood, completely frozen, his mouth hanging open, his chest heaving irregularly under his expensive cashmere sweater. The realization that he was standing in my house, that he had been giving orders and making threats in my house, paralyzed him from the inside out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take over. Before either of my parents could formulate a single excuse or demand, a loud, repetitive thudding echoed from the grand staircase in the foyer. We all turned our heads to see Chelsea struggling to drag a massive, heavy Louis Vuitton suitcase down the carpeted steps. She was still wearing the torn, ruined silk dress from earlier, but she had clearly sprinted upstairs to throw whatever expensive jewelry, cash, and designer accessories she could find into the bag. Her face was a mask of pure, selfish panic, her makeup smeared and her hair wild. She reached the bottom of the stairs and yanked the heavy suitcase across the marble tile, her ruined heels clicking frantically as she made a desperate break for the front door. "I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning," Chelsea screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at DeAndre, who was still huddled pathetically on the floor. "I am calling my father, U.S. lawyers, and I am taking absolutely everything. You lied to me, DeAndre. You told me you were a financial genius. You told me we had millions of dollars hidden away. You are nothing but a pathetic criminal, and I am not going down with you. I am not spending the best years of my life visiting you in some federal penitentiary while they auction off my clothes." The sound of her shrill, selfish voice snapped DeAndre out of his weeping shock. He scrambled to his feet, his face red and splotchy, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled and stained with floor wax and tears. He lunged across the foyer, throwing his entire body weight at Chelsea U.S. suitcase. "You are not going anywhere," DeAndre roared, tackling the heavy leather bag and pinning it to the floor. "That is my money in there. Those are my watches. You are not leaving me here to take the fall alone while you run back to your daddy." Chelsea let out a furious, animalistic shriek and kicked him squarely in the shin. The two of them collapsed onto the polished marble, locked in a vicious, pathetic scuffle over a suitcase full of stolen luxury goods. Chelsea was scratching wildly at his face, screaming obscenities, while DeAndre pulled her hair, trying to rip the leather handles from her iron grip. It was a disgusting display of pure greed and cowardice playing out right in the entryway of the grand estate. The facade of their perfect high society marriage was completely gone, revealing two shallow parasites fighting over the last scraps of a sinking ship. They clawed and bit at each other, their dignity entirely forgotten in the face of impending federal charges. Calvin completely ignored his son and daughter-in-law, rolling around on the foyer floor like feral animals. He turned his attention back to me, his posture stiffening as he tried desperately to summon the patriarchal authority he had relied on to control this family his entire life. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. He was trying to project power, but the sweat pouring down his forehead betrayed his absolute terror. "Now you listen to me," Tessa, Calvin commanded, his voice vibrating with a desperate, forced anger. "I do not care what kind of sneaky legal tricks your husband pulled to get his hands on this deed. I do not care what kind of technicalities you used. This is my family estate. I built this legacy from the ground up. I am the head of this household, and you are going to sign that property back over to me right this instant. You owe me for raising you. You owe me for paying your medical bills when you were a crippled child. I will not allow you to humiliate me in my own home. You will contact the bank tomorrow morning, and you will transfer the title back into my name, or so help me. God, I will disown you completely, and you will never see a dime of my money again." Julian did not even blink at the empty threat. He calmly slid the legal deed back into his leather briefcase and clicked the brass latches shut with a resounding snap. Then he took one slow, deliberate step forward, placing his large frame directly between Calvin and me. Calvin was a large man, but Julian was younger, taller, and exuded a quiet, terrifying menace that had nothing to do with raising his voice. Calvin tried to puff out his chest, attempting to physically intimidate my husband, but he looked like a fragile old man standing in front of a concrete wall. "You are not the head of any household," Calvin Julian said, his voice incredibly low and calm, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You are a delinquent debtor who secretly gambled away his wife, U.S. security, to fund his son, U.S. felonies. You do not own a single square inch of this property. You do not own the grass outside. You do not own the roof over your head. Tessa bought this estate through an irrevocable blind trust using her own money. The deed is fully recorded with the county clerk. The taxes are paid entirely in her name. There is absolutely no legal mechanism on earth that can force her to transfer ownership to you. You have absolutely no assets left to threaten her with. And if you ever raise your voice to my wife again, or threaten her in any way, I will personally have you removed from her property for criminal trespassing. Calvin deflated instantly. The blustering patriarchal rage completely abandoned him, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, desperate old man whose entire identity had just been erased. He looked at Julian, used cold, unyielding eyes, and realized that intimidation was utterly useless. He had no leverage. He had no power. He had no money. He was standing in a house that belonged to the disabled daughter he had always considered a failure, a burden and a stain on his perfect family image. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany front doors and the large dining room windows were illuminated by a blinding sequence of flashing red and blue lights. The frantic physical fight in the foyer stopped immediately. Chelsea froze, her hands still tangled in DeAndre's torn collar. DeAndre went completely pale, his eyes widening in absolute terror as the reality of the flashing lights sank in. The harsh strobe of the emergency vehicle lights cut through the elegant dining room, casting long, erratic shadows against the expensive floral wallpaper. The illusion of safety inside the grand estate was entirely shattered. We heard the loud, heavy slamming of multiple car doors out in the circular driveway. Heavy boots pounded in unison across the manicured front lawn and onto the stone porch. The sheer number of footsteps indicated a massive, coordinated raid. Federal agents, FBI Department of Justice, opened the door. Immediately, a booming, authoritative voice echoed through a heavy megaphone, shaking the glass in the front window panes. DeAndre let go of the suitcase entirely and scrambled backward on his hands and knees until his back hit the wall. He wrapped his arms around his legs, pulling himself into a tight, trembling ball of pure cowardice. Chelsea abandoned the luggage, backing away from the door, her hands covering her mouth as she let out a series of quiet, terrified sobs. There was nowhere left to run. Brenda let out a horrifying wail that sounded like it was torn from the very depths of her soul. She fell to her knees right in front of me, ignoring the spilled turkey gravy, the ruined cranberry sauce, and the broken crystal glass on the floor. She reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around my legs, clinging to my slacks like a drowning woman holding onto a life preserver in a raging storm. "Tessa, please!" Brenda sobbed hysterically, burying her tear-soaked face against my knee. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, leaving dark streaks across her cheeks. Her tears were soaking right through the fabric of my trousers. "Please, you have to go out there. You have to talk to them. You work for the government, Tessa. They know you. They will listen to you. Tell them it is all a big misunderstanding. Tell them DeAndre is a good boy. Tell them he did not mean to steal anything. You can fix this. You are the only one who can fix this. Please, Tessa, I am begging you as your mother, the woman who gave you life. Do not let them take my perfect son away. Do not let them destroy our family in front of the whole neighborhood. Just go out there and vouch for him. Tell them he is innocent and we will make everything right." The heavy metallic pounding on the front door grew significantly louder, vibrating violently through the hardwood floorboards under our feet. "Federal agents, open this door right now or we will breach." I looked down at the top of my mother's head. I looked at her perfectly highlighted hair, now tangled and messy from her frantic groveling. I looked at her manicured hands gripping my legs with desperate, selfish strength. Even now, with the FBI literally breaking down the front door, she was still asking me to sacrifice my integrity. She was still asking me to lie to federal agents to risk my own career and my own freedom to protect the golden son who had offered me up as a human shield to violent loan sharks just 30 minutes ago. She had learned absolutely nothing from this entire ordeal. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my legs one by one. I stepped back out of her reach, leaning heavily on the bent metal frame of my broken walker. The pain in my spine was a dull, continuous roar, but the clarity in my mind was absolute and crystal clear. I looked at the bent metal leg of the walker, the one DeAndre had damaged when he threw me to the floor to save his own skin. I looked down at my mother crying pathetically on the hardwood floor of the house that I owned. "My walker is broken," I said. My voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion, perfectly matching the cold reality of the situation. "I cannot walk to the door to vouch for him. You will have to get an Uber." The flashing red and blue lights eventually faded into the cold Atlanta night, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating reality. The federal agents had swarmed the house, seizing computers, freezing hard drives, and dragging my brother out the front door in handcuffs. Chelsea had screamed the entire time, completely abandoning her divorce threats the second she realized the feds might freeze her accounts too. It took exactly 48 hours for the dust to temporarily settle. 48 hours for Calvin to completely drain whatever hidden emergency funds he had left to post bail for DeAndre and Chelsea. They were out of federal holding, but they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Instead of laying low and preparing a legal defense, my parents did what they always did. They went on the offensive. They deployed a massive, highly coordinated smear campaign to protect their shattered social standing. Calvin and Brenda hit the phones immediately, contacting every senior elder at our prominent megachurch and every executive board member at their exclusive country club. They spun a narrative that was so entirely divorced from reality, it was almost impressive in its pure delusion. The story they sold to the community was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. They claimed that their disabled daughter was consumed by a bitter, lifelong jealousy. They told everyone that I had used my high-level government clearance to fabricate evidence and frame my own brother. According to Brenda, I was a deeply resentful woman who could not stand to see DeAndre succeeding and building a beautiful family, while I struggled with my physical limitations. They painted DeAndre as a brilliant, innocent businessman who was being persecuted by a corrupt federal system, guided by a vengeful sister. The backlash was immediate and absolutely vicious. My phone started buzzing continuously by Friday evening. The messages flooded in from people I had known my entire life. Aunt Vivian sent a long, rambling text calling me a disgrace to the family name and a traitor to my own blood. Deacon Hayes left a scathing voicemail accusing me of selling out my brother to the very systems designed to tear Black men down. Family friends who had eaten turkey at our table sent me private messages calling me a monster and a Judas. They accused me of tearing down Black excellence out of sheer spite. The vitriol was intense and entirely fueled by my parents' relentless lies. I sat at the granite kitchen island in the quiet sanctuary of the house Julian and I shared. My phone buzzed again with another hateful message from a cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone across the room. The time for tears and emotional devastation had completely passed on Thanksgiving night when my parents watched a criminal raise his fist to strike me and did absolutely nothing. All that was left inside me was a cold, razor-sharp focus. Julian walked into the kitchen, carrying 2 mugs of dark coffee and his heavy leather briefcase. He set a mug down in front of me and pulled up a stool. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask if I was okay. He knew exactly who I was. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed screenshots and social media posts. "They are circulating a private email chain among the church elders," Julian said, his voice steady and analytical. "Calvin is claiming you hacked into Apex Financial to plant the dummy accounts. Brenda is telling the country club ladies that you tried to extort them for the house deed and called the feds when they refused to pay." I took a sip of the hot coffee, letting the bitter taste center me. I opened my laptop and woke the screen. The soft glow illuminated the kitchen. "They are playing a dangerous game," I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "They think because I have always been the quiet, obedient daughter, I will just sit here and let them destroy my reputation to save theirs. They think they control the narrative because they hold the microphones." Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the granite counter. "So we take the microphone away from them. We spent the next 12 hours building a meticulous, completely waterproof counterattack. We were not just going to defend my name against their pathetic slander. We were going to publicly execute the Addams family facade so thoroughly that it could never be rebuilt. I pulled up the heavily redacted federal indictments that were now public record. I cross-referenced them with unredacted emails DeAndre had stupidly sent from his personal account months ago, detailing the exact offshore shell companies he was using to hide the stolen funds. I had legal copies of the foreclosure notices Calvin had desperately tried to bury. I had the official bank statements proving Calvin had drained his own wife U.S. equity. Julian organized the data into a pristine legal dossier. He drafted a comprehensive summary of facts backed by undeniable, verified evidence. We printed everything. We made 20 complete copies, bound in thick professional folders. There was no emotion in the paperwork. There were no desperate pleas for sympathy. It was just cold, hard, undeniable financial truth. The kind of truth that sent men to federal prison and ripped the masks off of wealthy hypocrites. Sunday morning arrived crisp and bright. The Atlanta air was cool, but the sun was shining relentlessly. I dressed with extreme care. I did not wear the subdued neutral colors my mother had always forced me into, so I would blend into the background. I wore a tailored crimson suit that fit perfectly over my frame. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, completely uncompromising style. Julian wore his sharpest dark navy suit, carrying the thick leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of my parents' U.S. lies. I did not bring my old bent walker. Julian had purchased a brand new state-of-the-art titanium mobility aid the day after Thanksgiving. It was sleek, strong, and completely silent. We pulled into the massive, overflowing parking lot of the megachurch just as the primary morning service was hitting its emotional peak. The sprawling sanctuary held over 2,000 congregants. This was the epicenter of my parents' US social power. This was where Calvin paraded around like a spiritual titan, and Brenda held court in the front pews draped in expensive hats and quiet judgment. We walked through the grand glass doors of the lobby. The ushers recognized me immediately, their eyes widening in shock. Several of them stepped back, whispering to each other clearly, having heard the vicious rumors circulating through the congregation. No one tried to stop us. The sheer undeniable authority radiating from Julian and the cold focused intensity in my eyes kept them completely paralyzed. We paused in the narthex just outside the heavy oak double doors that led directly into the back of the massive sanctuary. Through the thick wood, I could hear the booming sound of the pastor's microphone. But it was not the pastor speaking. It was my father. Calvin Addams was standing at the pulpit, his voice echoing through the massive room thick with manufactured grief and perfectly timed pauses. The entire congregation was completely silent, hanging on his every word. The devil works in mysterious and heartbreaking ways. My father proclaimed, his voice trembling with expert theatrical sorrow. He attacks our homes. He attacks our legacies. And sometimes he uses the people we love the most to bring darkness to our doorstep. My family is under a terrible spiritual attack. My son DeAndre, a good man, a pillar of this community, has been falsely accused. He has been targeted by a system that wants to see successful black men fail. I heard murmured choruses of agreement rolling through the 2,000 people sitting in the pews. And the hardest part? The burden that is breaking a mother-us heart, Calvin continued, his voice cracking perfectly, is that this betrayal came from inside our own home. Our daughter Tessa has allowed jealousy and bitterness to poison her spirit. She has used her position to fabricate lies against her own brother. We raised her with love. We supported her through her disabilities. We gave her absolutely everything, and she repaid that love with a knife to our backs. Brenda let out a loud, theatrical sob from her seat in the front row, perfectly amplifying the victim narrative. The congregation murmured again, this time with audible judgment and outrage, directed entirely at me. They were fully buying the performance. The Addams family was securing their status as tragic martyrs. I looked at Julian. He looked back at me. his expression completely calm and supportive. He reached out and placed his hand on the brass handles of the heavy oak doors. I gripped the ergonomic handles of my new titanium walker. My spine was perfectly straight. There was absolutely zero fear left inside my body. Julian pushed the doors open. They swung wide, catching the heavy morning sunlight streaming through the lobby windows and casting a massive shadow straight down the center aisle of the church. The hinges groaned slightly, cutting through the quiet, sympathetic murmurs of the congregation. The sound made several people in the back pews turn around. The gasps started instantly. It was a physical ripple of shock that traveled rapidly from the back of the enormous sanctuary all the way to the front. Heads turned in a massive wave. 2,000 people shifted in their seats, staring in absolute stunned silence. Calvin froze at the pulpit. His hands were gripping the wooden edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. The microphone picked up his sudden sharp intake of breath, broadcasting it across the massive room. His theatrical mask of sorrow completely evaporated instantly, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. Brenda twisted around in the front pew, her expensive silk hat dipping precariously. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes locking onto me with absolute horror. She knew exactly what was inside the briefcase Julian was carrying. I stepped over the threshold, the rubber tips of my titanium walker silent on the thick carpet. I did not hesitate. I did not look down. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the terrified man standing behind the pulpit, and I walked straight down the center aisle of the church. The silence in the massive sanctuary was so absolute that the only sound was the soft squeak of my titanium walker and the steady, confident thud of Julian's leather shoes right beside me. 2,000 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement. The people who had sent me vile messages the night before were sitting in their velvet pews staring at me like I was a ghost. Pastor Davis stepped out from behind the mahogany altar. His face was a mask of practiced pastoral concern, but his eyes were darting nervously toward Calvin. He raised his hands in a calming gesture, stepping directly into my path to block me from reaching the front. "Tessa, please," Pastor Davis said, his voice amplified by his lapel microphone. "This is a house of worship. Your family is in deep pain right now. We are gathered here to pray for your brother and to seek God's grace in this storm. I must ask you and your husband to leave the sanctuary before you cause any further disruption to the spirit of this service." I stopped my walker about 10 feet away from him. I did not raise my voice, but the acoustics of the massive room carried my words clearly to the front rows. "I am not leaving, Pastor," I said, my tone completely flat. "And if you want to talk about the spirit of this service, you might want to look at exactly who is standing at your pulpit." I bypassed the pastor entirely, steering my walker toward the low wall that separated the choir loft from the AV mixing station. For 5 years before my injury, I had volunteered in that tech booth every single Sunday, running the visuals and the soundboard. I knew the network architecture of this building better than the current media director did. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. The church network still used the same hidden administrator gateway I had set up years ago. Calvin realized what I was doing. His face went completely gray. "Stop her!" he yelled into his microphone, panic ripping through his booming voice. "Somebody stop her! She is trying to hack the church system!" 2 ushers started moving down the side aisle, but Julian simply turned and looked at them. He did not say a word. He just stood there with his arms resting at his sides, his physical presence so completely intimidating that both men stopped dead in their tracks and pretended to be adjusting the offering plates. I bypassed the security protocols and linked my phone directly to the main projection system. I did not say another word. I let the evidence do the screaming for me. The 3 massive lead screens suspended above the altar flickered wildly for a second. The carefully curated PowerPoint slides of rolling clouds and scripture verses vanished. They were instantly replaced by high-resolution scans of DeAndre and Chelsea U.S. joint bank statements alongside official wire transfer logs. The text was massive, easily readable from the very back of the balcony. I had specifically highlighted the origin accounts in bright yellow and the destination accounts in neon red. A low, confused murmur rolled through the congregation as people tried to make sense of the financial spreadsheets hovering above their heads. Then Deacon Hayes, who was sitting in the second row, stood up. He pulled his reading glasses from his pocket and stared at the screens. His booming voice cut through the confusion like a siren. "That is the Youth Scholarship Fund," Deacon Hayes roared, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "That is the origin account for the college ministry." The murmur instantly turned into a deafening roar. 2,000 people simultaneously realized what they were looking at. DeAndre had not just defrauded wealthy venture capitalists and anonymous hedge fund managers. He had used his father U.S. influence as a senior elder to access the church U.S. community outreach accounts. He and Chelsea had systematically siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Youth Scholarship Fund, routing the donations through their offshore shell companies to pay for their designer clothes and their luxury cars. They had stolen money from the congregation U.S.-owned children. Calvin gripped the edges of the pulpit, frantically shaking his head and shouting into the microphone. "It is a lie," Calvin yelled, his voice echoing over the rising fury of the crowd. "It is fabricated. She is trying to frame us." But the evidence was undeniable. I swiped my screen, pulling up the next document. It was an email from Chelsea to DeAndre complaining about the transfer limits on the church accounts and suggesting they forge the pastor's signature to bypass the weekly cap. The sanctuary completely erupted. The polite high society restraint of the congregation vanished instantly, replaced by absolute fury. Aunt Vivian, the woman who had texted me the night before calling me a traitor, jumped up from her pew. She threw her expensive church program directly at Brenda. "You thieves!" Aunt Vivian screamed, her voice raw with betrayal. "We trusted you. We gave our hard-earned money to send those kids to college, and your son stole it to buy another sports car. You are nothing but common criminals." Brenda fell back into the pew, covering her face with her hands as people all around her started shouting. The people who had been nodding in sympathetic agreement just 5 minutes ago were now turning on them with the vicious intensity of a betrayed mob. Calvin was frozen at the pulpit, looking out at the sea of furious faces, his entire empire of status and respectability completely disintegrating in real time right before his eyes. The facade was dead and buried. They were ruined. Julian touched my shoulder gently. "It is done," he said, his voice low. "Let us go." I turned my walker around and headed back up the center aisle. We walked right through the chaos. People parted for us completely silent as we passed, their anger reserved entirely for the two people sobbing at the altar. No one looked at me with pity. No one whispered that I was a burden or a jealous failure. They looked at me with a terrifying kind of awe. We pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out of the church lobby into the blinding Atlanta sunlight. The air felt incredibly clean. The sounds of the shouting congregation were muffled behind the thick walls. We walked slowly across the massive parking lot toward our car. My arms were shaking slightly from the physical exertion and the lingering adrenaline, but my mind was completely clear. We had survived. The truth was out. "Tessa, wait." The frantic voice came from the side of a large black SUV parked 3 spaces away from our car. Chelsea stepped out from the shadows. She looked like a completely different person. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her hair was a mess, and she was shaking uncontrollably. She had clearly not slept since the FBI raid. She looked around the parking lot frantically before rushing toward me, keeping a terrified distance from Julian. "Tessa, please!" Chelsea begged, her voice a desperate, pathetic whisper. "You have to listen to me. I know what you just did in there. I know it is all over. The feds have my passports. They froze my personal accounts. I have absolutely nothing." I stopped my walker, staring at the woman who had mocked my injury and practically danced when DeAndre offered me to the loan sharks. I did not say a word. "I can help you," Chelsea said, stepping closer, her eyes wild with pure, selfish survival instinct. "I know you are the main forensic investigator for the task force. I know you can make deals. I will give you absolutely everything. I have recordings. I have emails. I will testify that DeAndre orchestrated the entire church theft. I will give you his secret hard drives. She paused, taking a shuddering breath, leaning in closer. I will even testify about the physical abuse, Tessa. I will swear on the stand that DeAndre planned to assault you, that he deliberately targeted your disability to keep you quiet. I will give you the testimony you need to lock him away for the rest of his life. Just please, you have to give me immunity. You have to keep me out of federal prison. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom clicked shut, sealing the fate of the golden boy and his perfect wife. The immediate aftermath of the audio recording was a masterclass in total destruction. Julian stood from his seat in the gallery, his face an impenetrable mask, and waited for me at the wooden gate separating the spectators from the legal floor. I pushed my titanium walker forward, my movements smooth and unhurried. I did not look back at the defense tables. I did not need to see the panic in their eyes. I could feel it radiating off them like heat from a dying fire. The federal marshals moved swiftly, intercepting Calvin before he could take another step toward me. Two burly officers grabbed his arms, twisting them expertly behind his back despite his violent struggling. "Let me go!" Calvin roared, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. His spittle flew through the air as he thrashed against the marshals. "She is a liar. She set us up. I will destroy you, Tessa. I will tear your life apart piece by piece." The judge slammed his gavel down so hard the handle nearly snapped. "Remove that man from my courtroom instantly," the judge bellowed, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Place him under arrest for contempt and threatening a federal witness." Brenda scrambled up from the wooden bench, her expensive handbag slipping from her grasp and spilling its contents across the polished floor. "Calvin," she shrieked, reaching out uselessly as the marshals dragged her fiercely resisting husband backward toward the exit. "Do not hurt him. He is a respected elder. He has a heart condition." No one cared about his heart condition. The marshals hauled Calvin through the double doors, his threats cutting off abruptly as the heavy wood swung shut behind him. Brenda stood alone in the gallery, trembling violently, her eyes darting from the closed doors to the defense table, where DeAndre was now slumped forward, his head buried in his hands. The reality of their absolute ruin had finally penetrated her thick layers of delusion. Her perfect family, her country club status, her massive estate, it was all gone. Julian opened the wooden gate for me. He offered his arm not to support my weight, but as a silent anchor. I leaned my forearm against his, gripping my walker with my other hand, and we walked down the center aisle together. Brenda was standing directly in our path, her face streaked with mascara and tears. She looked hollowed out, a fragile shell of the arrogant matriarch who had demanded I lie to the FBI. "Tessa," Brenda whispered, her voice cracking as she reached a trembling hand toward me. "Please, you have to stop this. They are taking your father. They are going to lock up your brother. You won. You proved your point. Please just tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the recording was a joke." I stopped my walker. I looked at the woman who had watched her son physically assault me and had only cared about protecting her social standing. I looked at the mother who had asked me to sacrifice my freedom to save a criminal. "I did not win anything, Mother," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble floor beneath us. "I just stopped losing. And I am not going to lie for you ever again." I pushed past her, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably in the empty aisle, and walked out into the bright, chaotic glare of the courthouse lobby. The press was waiting. A sea of cameras, microphones, and flashing bulbs erupted the moment Julian and I stepped through the security checkpoint. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a deafening crescendo. "Miss Adams, is it true your brother stole from the church? Tessa, did your parents know about the offshore accounts? What is your response to your father's threats in the courtroom?" Julian seamlessly shifted his position, using his broad shoulders to create a physical barrier between me and the aggressive media swarm. He raised one hand, signaling for calm, his presence projecting a quiet, terrifying authority that instantly silenced the front row of reporters. My wife has just provided crucial testimony in an ongoing federal investigation, Julian said, his voice carrying easily over the clicking cameras. The evidence presented today speaks entirely for itself. Justice is being served, and we have no further comment at this time. He guided me toward the heavy glass exit doors, moving with a steady, protective grace. We stepped out into the humid Atlanta air, the sounds of the city traffic blending with the distant sirens. Our driver was waiting at the curb in a sleek black SUV. Julian opened the door, helped me secure my walker in the back, and settled into the seat beside me. The tinted windows rolled up, shutting out the noise and the flashing lights. The heavy doors locked with a solid, reassuring thud. We sat in the quiet luxury of the back seat as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the courthouse and the smoldering wreckage of the Adams family far behind us. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and closed my eyes. The dull, persistent ache in my spine was still there, a permanent reminder of the violence I had survived, but the suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 34 years was completely gone. "You did perfectly," Julian said quietly, his hand finding mine in the space between the seats. His fingers were warm and strong, grounding me in the present reality. I turned my head to look at him. He was watching me with an expression of profound, unconditional respect. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no calculation. There was only absolute partnership. "They are going to lose everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Calvin will go to prison for threatening a witness. DeAndre and Chelsea will serve federal time for the wire fraud and embezzlement. The church will seize whatever assets Brenda has left to recoup the stolen scholarship funds." Julian nodded slowly. "Yes. They built their entire empire on a foundation of lies and exploitation. Gravity was always going to pull it down. You just refused to be the pillar holding it up anymore." I looked out the tinted window as the city skyline rushed past. The towering glass buildings, the crowded streets, the relentless momentum of Atlanta. For the first time in my life, I was not afraid of what came next. I was not terrified of my father, us wrath, or my mother, us judgment. I was not shrinking myself to fit into a mold that was designed to suffocate me. We drove back to the estate, my estate. The massive iron gates swung open smoothly as we approached, welcoming us onto the manicured grounds. The sprawling mansion stood quietly in the afternoon sun, its elegant columns and wide porches looking peaceful and secure. It was no longer a monument to Calvin's ego or a prison for my insecurities. It was simply a house, and it belonged to me. Julian helped me out of the car, carrying my briefcase and walking beside me as I navigated the stone pathway to the front door. Inside the house was cool and quiet. The extravagant, tacky decorations Brenda had insisted on were gone, replaced by clean lines, warm light, and spaces designed for comfort rather than display. I left my walker by the entryway and walked slowly into the massive kitchen, leaning lightly on the granite island. Julian poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to me. "What happens now?" he asked, leaning against the counter and watching me carefully. I took a slow sip of the cold water, letting the silence of my home settle around me. I thought about the millions of dollars safely secured in my blind trusts. I thought about my immaculate career at the Department of Justice. I thought about the husband standing in front of me, who had walked into a war zone without hesitation simply because I asked him to. Now I said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. We changed the locks that very afternoon, but the real closure came exactly 3 months later when the federal judge handed down the final sentences. The trial was a media spectacle, a complete public dismantling of the pristine Adams family image. The courtroom was packed every single day with reporters, church elders, and former country club friends who showed up just to watch the empire burn. Chelsea took the stand on the second day of the trial. She wore a demure pastel cardigan and styled her hair to look as soft and fragile as possible. She wept openly, clutching a tissue to her chest, and tried to play the role of the innocent, manipulated wife. She told the jury that DeAndre was a controlling monster who forced her to sign banking documents she did not understand. She claimed she was terrified of his temper and that she had absolutely no idea the money funding her luxury vacations and designer wardrobe was stolen from church scholarships and naive investors. DeAndre sat at the defense table grinding his teeth so hard his jaw visibly popped. His high-priced defense attorney tried everything in his power to shift the blame. When it was my turn to take the witness stand, the defense attorney paced back and forth trying to paint me as a bitter disabled sister seeking revenge. He asked leading questions about my physical limitations, trying to imply that I was deeply jealous of my brother's perfect health and perfect life. He suggested that my career at the Department of Justice was just a tool I used to construct a complex frame job against a brother I had secretly hated since childhood. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single tear fall. I sat in the witness chair perfectly composed and methodically dissected every single financial transaction DeAndre and Chelsea had executed over the past 4 years. I explained the offshore shell companies, the dummy accounts, and the forged wire transfers, with the cold clinical precision of a veteran federal investigator. And then the prosecution introduced the audio recordings. Julian had quietly recorded the entire confrontation in the dining room on Thanksgiving Day. The jury sat in absolute stunned silence as the crystal-clear audio echoed through the federal courtroom. They heard DeAndre actively admitting to the fraud. They heard him threatening to let the loan sharks break my legs to save his own skin. They heard Chelsea explicitly demanding her share of the embezzled church funds and screaming about hiding the luxury assets. The pastel cardigan and the fake tears meant absolutely nothing after the jury heard the pure venom and greed in her real voice. The defense completely crumbled. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on every single count. The judge did not show an ounce of mercy. He called their actions a grotesque violation of community trust and familial duty. DeAndre stood trembling as he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. The golden boy, the untouchable heir to the Adams legacy, openly sobbed as the federal marshals clamped heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Chelsea collapsed against the defense table when she was sentenced to 7 years. Her wealthy parents, who were sitting in the back row, immediately stood up and walked out of the courtroom, refusing to even look at her as she was led away to a holding cell. Calvin's desperate outburst in the gallery during the trial earned him an immediate contempt of court charge. But once the federal prosecutors dug into his heavily redacted financial records, they found a mountain of tax evasion and wire fraud linked to his desperate attempts to cover his son U.S. tracks. He was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility. For a man whose entire identity was built on absolute pride and patriarchal authority, it might as well have been a death sentence. With the criminal trials finally concluded, the civil consequences caught up to Brenda and Calvin with brutal speed. Their bank accounts were frozen and seized to pay back the victims. The church elders officially excommunicated them, pulling their massive pensions and demanding full financial restitution. Their country club memberships were publicly revoked. The community they had ruled with an iron fist completely turned their backs on them, treating them like absolute pariahs. The day of their eviction was gray and heavy with impending rain. Julian and I parked my modified SUV across the street from the smaller secondary townhouse they had retreated to after I claimed the main estate. The bank was foreclosing on the townhouse to pay back the stolen church funds. I sat in the passenger seat watching through the tinted glass as the court-appointed movers indiscriminately tossed my parents' belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. Brenda walked out the front door, carrying 2 black trash bags full of whatever clothes she was allowed to keep. She looked frail and entirely broken. The immaculate hair, the expensive jewelry, and the arrogant posture were completely gone. They were being forced to move into a tiny run-down 2-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. It was a neighborhood my mother used to actively mock during her charity luncheons, calling it a haven for failures and delinquents. Now it was the absolute only place that would accept their utterly destroyed credit and lack of income. I watched Calvin shuffle out to the curb carrying a single plastic tote bin. His shoulders were slumped, his face hollow and gray. He looked completely defeated, stripped of every single ounce of his arrogant authority. They loaded their meager remaining possessions into a rented moving van. They had absolutely nothing left. Julian put the car in drive and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the ashes of their fake empire in the rearview mirror. We drove back to the estate, my estate. When we pulled through the massive iron gates, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. Julian had spent the last 3 months secretly coordinating with the best architectural contractors in Atlanta, while I was focused on testifying at the trials. I rolled my new titanium walker through the front double doors and stopped dead in my tracks. The grand foyer had been completely transformed. The heavy, oppressive mahogany paneling and the tacky, massive chandeliers Brenda had loved so much were entirely gone. The space was now flooded with warm, natural light, painting the walls in soft, inviting tones. But the most breathtaking changes were not aesthetic. They were completely structural. Julian had retrofitted the entire 12,000 square foot mansion to be universally accessible. The harsh marble transitions and awkward steps between rooms were replaced by smooth, seamless hardwood floors. Every single doorway on the ground level had been expertly widened. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen and felt my breath catch in my throat. The granite countertops had been lowered to perfectly accommodate my height and mobility needs. The custom cabinets featured pull-down shelving. Every single inch of the space had been designed to empower me rather than restrict me. I turned around and looked toward the grand staircase. Tucked discreetly into the elegant alcove beside it was a sleek, modern glass elevator. Julian walked up beside me, placing a warm, heavy hand on the small of my back. "I wanted this house to serve you," Julian said, his voice incredibly soft but filled with that familiar, unyielding strength. "I never want you to feel like a prisoner in your own home ever again. You own this space, Tessa. It should rise up to meet you." I walked slowly toward the bottom of the grand staircase. I parked my walker and stood exactly on the spot where DeAndre had thrown me to the floor on Thanksgiving Day. The exact spot where my father had loomed over me, calling me a failure and a crippled burden. The spot where my mother had watched me writhe in physical agony and told me not to ruin the expensive carpet. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath, waiting for the familiar surge of blinding anger and crushing betrayal that used to define my entire existence. I waited for the phantom pain of my childhood trauma to wash over me. It did not come. There was absolutely no anger left inside me. There was no fear. There was no lingering, desperate need for their validation, their approval, or their conditional love. Looking at that spot on the polished hardwood floor, all I felt was absolute, cold, unshakable power. They had spent 34 years trying to convince me that I was broken. They had tried to make me believe that my physical disability made me less of a human being, that my intelligence was a threat to be suppressed and hidden away. They had built a hollow, glittering empire out of lies, stolen money, and the ruthless exploitation of their own disabled daughter. And I had methodically dismantled every single brick of it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of bent, jagged metal. It was the broken adjustment pin from my old medical walker, the one DeAndre had damaged when he violently threw me down. I had kept it in my pocket for the last 3 months, carrying it through the federal trial and the depositions as a tangible reminder of their cruelty. It had been a physical anchor to my righteous fury, keeping me sharp and focused when the defense attorneys tried to break me down. I rolled the piece of broken metal between my fingers, feeling the sharp edges against my skin one last time. I did not need it anymore. I was no longer the victim they had created. I walked over to the sleek stainless steel trash can hidden perfectly under the newly lowered kitchen counter. I held my hand out and dropped the broken piece of metal into the bin. It hit the bottom with a quiet, hollow clatter, and then there was nothing but the peaceful, comforting silence of my home. Julian stepped up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and resting his chin gently on the top of my head. I leaned back against his solid chest, completely supported, and entirely safe. We stood there together looking out through the massive bay windows, at the sprawling manicured lawns and the ancient oak trees swaying gently in the warm afternoon breeze. I took a deep, steadying breath. The air in the house smelled like fresh paint and polished wood. It smelled like freedom. It smelled like a completely new beginning. I had not just survived the Addams family. I had absolutely conquered them. I had taken their cruelest weapons, their judgment, their financial manipulation, and their social arrogance, and I had turned them into the precise instruments of my own liberation. I had built a real empire, a life of absolute truth, unwavering partnership, and immense unassailable power, and I had done it entirely on the ashes of their fake one. The greatest lesson I learned is that blood does not automatically make someone family. True family is built on respect and unconditional love, not manipulation and control. You do not owe your loyalty to people who constantly tear you down, even if they share your last name. The most powerful act of self-love is walking away from toxic dynamics and building your own empire from scratch. If you have ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories.